right, so this video is going to be a short discussion about the whole issue of relativism. This is an important topic both in my philosophy courses, logic courses, ethics courses. I'm going to try to make this more in the form of a sort of a podcast, so the visuals aren't that important that you see them if you're wanting to use this as, like I say, just listen to it as opposed to sort of watch it on a computer screen. But we'll see what we can do. So one of the reasons that relativism is so important that we sort of dismiss it at the beginning of any of these philosophy courses is that it just promotes sort of sloppy thinking, and it really makes the whole discussion of ethics and philosophy sort of ridiculous if everything is absolutely relative. And so oftentimes you'll hear people just say sort of like, hey, there's no real right or wrong, everything depends. And so what I want to say is what we want to think about is, what does it depend on? What is it that makes one thing different than another? What often happens when somebody claims that something is true, is just categorically true, and therefore what you're saying is wrong, that we sort of repel against that and say, oh, that is so rude, as if I'm insulting you because you are mistaken. And the role of philosophy and ethics and logic is to be able to address those questions. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I don't know where you're listening to this on, but if we decided that we wanted to go on a trip to Florida and we got on I-71 heading north, sooner or later somebody in the group is going to have to say, we are going the wrong direction. We will never get to Florida by way of 71 north. I'm not being rude. I'm not calling you stupid, but I am saying we are going the wrong way. And so it's important that we recognize that disagreeing is okay, and disagreeing fundamentally and believing that somebody is wrong is okay. What we want to do is be able to articulate what is it that we find to be wrong. Can we make persuasive arguments so that what we can help other people see what we see to be true? Now, could be we're mistaken. And so when we articulate that, somebody else may be able to help us to understand better what is true. And so we can abandon our mistaken beliefs and then come to know what is true. Frequently, when people want to assert this absolute relative position, they really fall back on one of two statements. Sometimes it is, well, I have the right to believe whatever I want to believe. That's true. You're absolutely true. You may believe whatever you want to believe. But the moment that you say that what you believe is true, you have now gone outside of your belief system and you have made an appeal to truth. And truth has to be verifiable. It has to actually relate to something that is, in fact, the case in the world. So if you want to believe that the moon is made out of green cheese, that's fine. You can believe it. But the moment you say the moon is green cheese, you're now asserting that that is true. And then the burden of proof shifts to you to demonstrate, to prove that your belief is true. It's not my job to disprove what you say. It's your job to validate it. You can believe whatever you want, but the minute you assert that it is truth, and especially if you want me to act on that truth, it is your burden to demonstrate that it is in fact the case. Fundamentally, the problem with relativism is that it doesn't logically work. The idea that everything is just absolutely relative and there is no absolute truth doesn't hold logically. Now, in pure logic, we use this phrase, we'll say P cannot equal not P. In logic, we like to use P's and Q's and letters to express. So P could be any expression. It can't be true and not true. I can't be sitting in this chair and not sitting in the chair. unless we're playing some sort of language game, and so it's sort of a riddle, and that's where a lot of jokes and puns are situated, because I'm using words in a different way. But when we're using what's called ordinary language, and I say, I am sitting in this chair, it can't be the case that I am not sitting in the chair. P cannot equal not P. Something can't be right and wrong at the same time. The logical inconsistency of relativism has been observed since the very beginning of Western philosophy. Plato, writing about his great mentor Socrates, discusses an argument between Socrates and Pythagoras, and the contradiction is in place. Pythagoras is essentially arguing that everybody's opinion is right, and in their own mind it's right, and therefore it is true. And Socrates observes the fact that, well, look, if everybody's opinion is right, then the opinion of people who disagree with me have to also be right, in which case I am both right and wrong at the same time, and that is a impossible inconsistency. That's it just doesn't work, right? It's a contradiction. So all the way back to ancient times, it was observed that we all can't be right because it doesn't work logically. But we don't have to go all the way back to ancient Greece to establish this. You can see in an argument where somebody is trying to, usually what happens is they get backed into a corner. They're backed into a logical corner. And so since their arguments no longer hold any weight and they're basically losing the argument, they will then resort to saying, well, there just aren't any rules. There's no absolutes. Now, you probably figured out that's a contradiction. If you say there are no rules, that in itself is a rule. So you're asserting that there's at least one rule, and that rule is there are no rules, right? There's no absolutes except this absolute statement that says there are no absolutes. And so then the question, you begged your own question. Well, if you can have one absolute rule, that why can't there be two? And so since you have asserted that there is one absolute rule, then you've eliminated the possibility that there are no rules. In which case now we're wide open in the area of ethics, philosophy, and logic to explore what exactly are the rules. So then we're confronted with this whole world of ethics and morals, and the idea of saying, well, isn't ethics just a game where there's no rules? Everybody sort of has their own opinion of what's right and what's wrong. Each society, each culture has its own rules. And who's to say sort of why one is better than the other? I mean, it really becomes again, so who says so? Where did these rules come from? And so before we go down that road, let's go the other direction and say, so people say, well, morality is really up to the individual. It's each person and what they believe to be right. Well, let me ask you this question. Have you ever made a mistake? Have you ever been wrong? So if morality is left up to you to decide what's right and wrong, we're all in trouble, because you know you've made mistakes. And you could make a really vital, critical moral mistake, because if you're the person who makes the rules and you already acknowledge that you are wrong, then we're in big trouble. And the same thing is true of society. If we say, well, the ethics and morality is really based on how a society views something. Again, have we ever known situations where society, cultures, and governments made huge mistakes, or things that we look at and we say, wow, that was terrible? The Trail of Tears here in the United States, slavery, female genital mutilation, the Holocaust. We can look at lots of examples where whole groups of people, societies, cultures, did something that was terrible and morally reprehensible. So we can't merely say that each society gets to make its own rules, because we know that they make horrible decisions sometimes. So frequently what I will do in my ethics courses is we'll just start with a discussion of horror, of terrible things. Again, the Holocaust, a famous example. Late in the war, Hitler's forces were losing, and the economy was in a shambles, and they needed a way to start saving some money. And so Hitler proposed the idea that they take everybody that's old and anybody that's suffering from a disease that is not curable, a chronic fatal disease, and execute them so that they're not a burden on the national economy. Or, again, the Trail of Tears here in the United States. Somebody thought this brilliant idea of marching Native Americans halfway across the country from a beautiful, lush forest and dumping them in desert land that nobody wanted. Somebody thought that was a good idea. Now, that was a horrible, the same thing with female genital mutilation. These are practices that are, by their very nature, horrible and offensive to our sensibility. Now, if we start on the extreme end of what are terrible things, child molesting and children sold into prostitution, we can say, okay, those are horrible. And then we might think of other things that are just wonderful, gracious and wonderful actions. Then what we do is we try to figure, okay, let's figure out where the line is. Let's say, okay, we agree that way over there is bad things and way over there are good things. I'm a big fan of a philosopher named James Rachels. He wrote a really small book, but it's been very influential, called The Elements of Moral Philosophy. And what Rachels wants to do is say that when we approach morality and ethics, many people think that morality, the laws of morality are almost like physical laws, like the law of gravity or mathematics, that there are absolute moral truths and we just have to find them and uphold them. On the extreme other end are people who would say there are no rules. Everything is entirely subjective, that morality is just another way of saying this is what I prefer, or this is what people like me prefer. But Rachel says we can't simply surrender the field that easily. What we need to do is establish that moral thinking is, in fact, reasonable. And I have this quote, I quote this all the time. Morality is, at the very least, the effort to guide one's conduct by reason. That is, to do what there are the best reasons for doing, while giving equal weight to the interest of each individual who will be affected by what one does. And so the essential thing is to say that what makes something moral is that it is the reasonable thing to do. And it doesn't mean that it's purely rational, but it means you think about what the options are. You think about what the reasons would be to do something and not to do something. And the one that has the best reason is the reasonable thing to do. And so we may not necessarily have to agree on every single thing about absolute truth. What we can say, let's think about what is reasonable to do in a given situation. So I want to close out with a shout out to an American philosopher named Quine. He was a logician. And one of the things that he basically says is if ethics is culturally bound, if ethics and morality are locked up in what your culture says, then there's no such thing as progress. That nobody could ever critique their own society, because to do so would be immoral, because the morality is itself established by the group. And again, we can think about civil rights leaders. We can think about those that campaign against slavery. We can think about those who campaign against or for women to have the right to vote. Each of those social movements was a critique that the culture was wrong and needed to change. And his point is that there's a logical contradiction if we want to say that morality is socially constructed, because that would mean that societies cannot change. And obviously we know that that is false. Well, I hope that this short discussion of relativism gave you something to think about. In case you're still not persuaded, I've had in one of my courses a student who was just adamant that there were absolutely no rules, that there was no right or wrong. And after we had talked and he'd gone through the readings and different stuff, he still wanted to sort of defend his position. And I said, well, I guess I'm just going to have to fail you. And he immediately erupted by saying, you can't do that. That's not right. And you see, I got him, didn't you? so that even those who want to really proclaim that there are no absolutes, when they experience injustice, it becomes pretty obvious that there must be some sort of rules. Many ethicists believe that empathy and is a root at which we develop our morality, that our common experience as humans is what gives rise to our feeling of the way we ought to be treated. And so that gives rise to a moral center. So hope it gives you some food for thought. And this is Dr. Shell sauntering on.